Have you ever wondered if the Bible you know today is the same as the one that was originally written? Have you heard of supposed changes, omissions, or even contradictions between the original texts and the current versions? What do you think the truth behind this is? The answer might surprise you. The Bible is the most read and influential book in human history, but it's also one of the most controversial. Over the centuries, it has been translated, copied, and rewritten countless times. But did the content change in the process? Or is the text we have today faithful to what was originally revealed? If you want to understand what's behind these questions and discover the truth about the Bible and its changes, stay with me until the end. What we're going to reveal today will change the way you see this ancient book. The formation of the Bible. To understand whether the Bible has changed, we need to go back in time. It all begins with the Old Testament, with the earliest writings dating back more than 3,000 years. The Bible was not written all at once, but over several centuries by different authors, in different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. When we talk about the Old Testament, we're referring to a collection of books, including historical accounts, poetry, laws, and prophecies. What many people don't realize is that in the beginning there was no Bible as we have it today. These texts were passed down from generation to generation, primarily through manuscripts. These manuscripts were copied by hand by scribes, and despite their careful work, copyist errors were inevitable. But were these errors mere mistakes, or were they intentional changes? The Bible in the ancient world. When the Bible was translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC, in the famous translation called the Septuagint, the first discrepancies began to appear. The Septuagint was an effort to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, because many Jews in the Hellenistic Empire no longer spoke Hebrew. And here is where one of the big questions arises. Was this translation faithful? Some scholars believe that over time, the text was adapted to make it more understandable to the readers of the time. But in some cases, this may have led to a modification of the original message. However, as time went on, more translations emerged, each with its own particularities. In the case of the New Testament, which came much later, between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the story becomes even more complicated. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by authors who were not present at every event they describe. And among the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, we find significant variations, changes in the manuscripts. Did you know that we have thousands of ancient manuscripts of the Bible? In the New Testament alone, more than 5,800 manuscripts have been found, not to mention copies in other languages, like Latin and Coptic. But here's an important point. The manuscripts are not identical. There are differences. Some are minor, like typos or variations in word formatting. But others are more complex, involving entire passages that differ between manuscripts. For example, the famous passage in John 7:53, 8-11 about the woman caught in adultery appears in some manuscripts but is absent from others. This raises an important question. Was this passage added later? If so, why? And if it was added, what else might have been altered over the centuries? Furthermore, there are textual variations in other books as well, such as Acts, Paul's letters, and even in the Gospels. The main reason for these differences is not necessarily an intentional attempt to alter the message, but rather the process of manually transmitting the texts. Sometimes, a copyist would make a deliberate change to clarify something or correct what they thought was an error. Yet, these changes, even if minor in many cases, influence how we understand the texts today. Translation and interpretation over time. The translation of the Bible over the centuries is also a key issue. How can such an ancient text be accurately translated into modern languages? The answer is not simple. Every translation is an interpretation, and sometimes the meaning of words can vary from one language to another. A clear example of this is the Greek word agape, which means love, but in Portuguese it might be translated as charity or brotherly love, depending on the context. Other, more complex cases involve entire passages that can be interpreted in very different ways, depending on the translation used. And this doesn't just happen because of errors or mistakes. Often the choices made by translators reflect the theological beliefs of the time the translation was done. The King James Version, one of the most well-known translations, for example, was translated in the 17th century with a strong influence from Protestant Christianity. This led to certain words and passages being given new interpretations aligned with the Protestant doctrine of that time. What this shows us is that beyond copy errors, there is a matter of how doctrines and worldviews over time influence the translation and interpretation of the biblical texts. The role of the canons and the formation of the official Bible. An interesting question many people ask is, how do we know which books truly belong in the Bible? The formation of the canon, that is, the official list of books that make up the Bible, was a long and often controversial process. The canon of the Old Testament was widely recognized among Jews, but the formation of the New Testament took longer. During the early centuries of the Christian era, there were many other writings circulating, known as apocryphal Gospels or Gnostic Gospels. These texts were not included in the New Testament. But why? What determined which books would be considered inspired and which would be rejected? The process of forming the canon involved much discussion and debate among early Christians, theologians, and church leaders. Some books, like the letters of Paul and the Gospels, were widely accepted, while others, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary, never received uniform acceptance. The Council of Hippo in the 4th century was one of the important milestones when the list of New Testament books, as we know it today, was established. Understanding this process helps us realize that, in addition to translations and textual variations, there was also a very strong historical and theological factor in defining what would be considered canonical, that is, divinely inspired. This doesn't mean the process was perfect or without controversy, but the goal of the early Christians was to preserve the original teachings, the message of Christ, and the most authentic accounts of his life and work. So when we look at the Bible and its versions over time, we need to understand that changes have occurred, whether due to copyist errors, translation variations, or the formation of the canon. But what remains unchanged in essence is the central message of the Bible, the message of faith, love, salvation, and morality. The variations in the text don't alter the foundations of the Christian faith, but remind us that the Bible is a living book, continually studied, debated, and reinterpreted according to the needs and understandings of each era.